The morning the regiment marched out of Hartwell, the whole village pressed against the churchyard wall to watch the officers ride past, and Eleanor Vane stood among them in a grey wool gown that had been turned twice at the cuffs, holding a basket of bread for the men who would eat nothing else before the coast. She was not there to be seen. She had learned long ago that being seen in a place like this was rarely a kindness. The captain, who would one day search every drawing room in 3 counties for her face, rode by within an arm's length of where she stood, and he did not look at her, and when his horse shied at the noise of the crowd, he steadied it with one gloved hand and said to the lieutenant beside him that the parish had sent out its plainest to wish them well, and that he supposed a soldier must be grateful even for plain bread. The lieutenant laughed. Eleanor did not move. The bread in her basket was still warm against her wrists, and she kept her eyes on the middle distance, on the grey stone of the church tower, on anything that was not the back of the captain's blue coat as he passed. To the village she was the curate's poor relation, the girl who had come to Hartwell after her father died with nothing but a trunk of mended linen and a small worn miniature of a woman she barely remembered. To the captain that morning she was a face not worth the turning of his head. What neither of them knew, what the war itself would take 4 long years to teach him, was that the plain girl with the warm bread had given the last shilling of her quarter's allowance to buy the flour, and had baked through the night so that no man would march to the sea on an empty stomach. Stay with me, because the man who could not be troubled to look at her would one day cross a crowded ballroom to find her, and the distance he traveled was longer than any road to any coast. His name was Captain Julian Ashcombe, and he was the second son of a house that had run out of fortune before it ran out of pride. He had bought his commission with the last clean money his family possessed, and he wore his rank the way some men wear a borrowed coat, conscious always of where it pinched. He was 24 that spring, tall and hard through the shoulders with dark hair. He kept too short for fashion, and a jaw that the village girls called handsome, and the village mothers called cold. He had been raised to believe that worth was a thing one could read at a glance, in the cut of a gown and the carriage of a head, and Eleanor, in her turned grey wool, had failed that reading entirely. She was 23, slight. With brown hair she wore in a plain knot because she had no maid to dress it otherwise, and grey eyes that the curate's wife said were her only good feature and her worst, because they saw too much and forgave too little. Her father had been a gentleman of small means and large debts, and when the fever took him, she had discovered that the gentleness of her upbringing had purchased her exactly nothing in the world's ledger. She had come to her cousin the curate because there was nowhere else to come. She kept the parish accounts because she had a head for figures. She visited the sick because no one else would. She had decided somewhere in the long months after the funeral that she would not let the smallness of her circumstances make her small, and she held to that decision the way a drowning woman holds to a spar. The morning of the march, after the dust of the horses had settled, she carried the empty basket back through the churchyard and stopped, as she always did, at the grave of a child she had never known. It was a small stone, weathered nearly smooth, and the name on it had worn away to a single letter. She did not know whose child it was. She knew only that no one tended it, and that a grave no one tended seemed to her the loneliest thing in the world, and so she pulled the weeds from around it and set a sprig of rosemary against the stone, as she had done every week for 2 years. She did not know that the curate had watched her do it from the vestry window and had told his wife, and that his wife had told the apothecary, and that in this way the village had built its private and unspoken account of the girl it pretended not to see. The war was long. The letters that came back to Hartwell were few and grew fewer. 2 of the men who had marched out that morning did not march home. The captain's name appeared once in the county paper, in a list of officers commended for holding a bridge that should not have been held, and Eleanor read it aloud to the curate's wife, over the breakfast things, and felt nothing in particular, or told herself she felt nothing, which was a different matter. In the 2nd year of the war, Eleanor's circumstances changed, though not in any direction the world would have called improvement. The curate's wife fell ill, and Eleanor nursed her. And when the curate himself was offered a better living in the north, he took his wife with him. and there was no room in the new arrangement for a poor relation who kept the accounts. Eleanor was offered by the kindness of the apothecary's sister a position as governess to the two small children of the Dowager Countess of Wexford, whose grandson had inherited the title, and the great house at Wexford Park 3 miles from Hartwell, and who ruled both the house and the grandson from a wing of rooms hung with the portraits of better days. It was the Dowager who first gave Eleanor the name that would follow her. She arrived at Wexford Park on a wet afternoon in October, her trunk on the back of the carrier's cart, and was shown into a morning room where the Dowager sat in black silk with a fan she did not need in October, and looked Eleanor up and down with the unhurried thoroughness of a woman appraising livestock. The Dowager Countess was past 70 and had buried a husband, 2 sons, most of her illusions, and had organized what remained of her life around the single conviction that the order of the world was correct and that her chief duty was to defend it. She was not cruel for the pleasure of it. She was cruel the way weather is cruel, without malice and without mercy, because that was simply the climate she had become. She told Eleanor that the children were difficult, that the last 3 governesses had not lasted a season, and that she expected obedience, punctuality, and silence. Then she said to the housekeeper standing by the door that she supposed the charity girl would do until something better could be found, and that one could hardly expect polish from a person who had been passed about the parish like a dish. No one wished to finish. The charity girl, Eleanor, heard the words settled over her like the cold that had come in with the rain. She curtsied and said that she would do her best to give satisfaction, and did not let her face change at all. And only the small white pressure of her knuckles around the handle of her reticule betrayed what the words had cost. The housekeeper saw it. The Dowager did not. The 2 children were a boy of 7 and a girl of 5, and they were not difficult so much as frightened, which Eleanor understood at once because she had been frightened herself, and frightened children, she had found, were only children who had learned that the adults around them could not be relied upon. Their mother had died bringing the girl into the world. Their father, the young earl, was somewhere on the continent with his own regiment and had not been home in 2 years. They had been raised by a procession of governesses and the cold weather of their great-grandmother, and the boy had stopped speaking almost entirely, and the girl screamed in the night, and could not say why. Eleanor did not try to make them obey. She made them bread, in the great kitchen, with her own hands and the cook's grudging permission, and she let them push their fingers into the dough, and she told them the story of the child's grave in the Hartwell churchyard, and the rosemary she set against the stone, and the boy, who had not spoken to a governess in a year, asked her in a whisper whose child it was. She told him she did not know. She told him that was rather the point, that one tended what was lonely precisely because no one else would. And the boy looked at her for a long moment with his mother's eyes and said very quietly that he would like to see the grave one day. It was the first full sentence the household had heard from him in 11 months. The housekeeper, whose name was Mrs. Pell, and who had served the family for 40 years, began to leave small things in Eleanor's path: an extra candle, a better cut of meat at the governess's solitary supper, a wool shawl, found in a chest, that no one would miss. Eleanor noticed. She said nothing, because gratitude spoken aloud in that house had a way of becoming a debt. But she folded the shawl with great care each morning, and she did not forget. The war ended in the spring of the 4th year, and the men came home. They did not all come home the same. Julian came home to find his elder brother dead of a fever, caught in a damp barracks, and himself, by that grim arithmetic, the heir to the very pride and the very emptiness he had spent 4 years trying to outrun. He came home thinner and harder and quieter, with a habit of going still in the middle of a sentence, as though listening for something that was no longer there. He came home, too, with a thing he carried in the breast pocket of his coat, and touched, without knowing he touched it, a small flat shape that the men of his company had learned not to ask about. What had happened was this, and he had told no one. In the second winter of the war, holding a position in the mountains that the maps insisted was secure, his company had taken in a boy, a local child of perhaps 9 years, who carried messages between the villages for a coin and a heel of bread. The boy had been useful, and then the boy had been brave, and then on a gray morning that Julian could not stop returning to, the boy had been sent with a message down a road that Julian himself had judged safe. And the road had not been safe, and the boy had not come back. They had found his satchel. They had not found him. Julian had carried the satchel's small contents ever since. A flat tin whistle the boy had used to signal the pickets, and he had learned in the carrying that a man could be commended for holding a bridge and damned in the same season for the judgment of a single road, and that the world did not balance these things, and that he would have to balance them himself, or not at all. He had marched to war despising plain bread and plain faces and the plain people who offered them. He came home, understanding in a way he could not yet put into words that the plain people were the ones who had fed the boy, sheltered the boy, wept for the boy, when the officers had only filed their reports. Something in his reading of the world had broken, and he did not yet know what to put in its place. Like? He came back to Hartwell because his family's small remaining property lay near it, and because the new Earl of Wexford, his old friend from the regiment, had written to say he was returning at last to his children and his grandmother, and would be glad of a familiar face at the great house. And so, on a bright, cold afternoon in late autumn, the captain rode up the avenue of Wexford Park, and in the long gallery, while he waited for the Earl to be told of his arrival, he heard, through a half-open door, a woman's voice reading aloud. She was reading to the little girl who had a fever, and the voice was low and steady and unhurried, and it was telling the story of a child's grave that no one tended, and a sprig of rosemary set against a worn stone, and Julian stood in the gallery with his hat in his hand and found that he could not move. He did not know the voice. He knew, the way the body knows a thing before the mind permits it, that the woman attached to it had sat by a feverish child for no wage that could account for the patience in her tone, and that he had spent 4 years learning to recognize exactly this, the quiet, costly tending of what the world had decided not to tend. He did not see her face that day. The Earl came, and there were greetings, and the half-open door was closed by a passing footman, and the voice was lost. Yet that night at dinner, when the dowager spoke of the children's governess with a small dismissive turn of her fan, calling her the charity girl, the curate's people had been glad to be rid of, Julian set down his glass, with a care that drew the Earl's glance, and asked in a level voice. The dowager told him it hardly signified. He did not ask again. He had learned, in 4 years, when a question was better carried than spoken. He saw her first 3 days later, in the cold light of the estate's east lawn, where she was walking the 2 children along the gravel with the boy's hand in hers, and the girl recovered, now running ahead. Eleanor wore her gray wool and a borrowed shawl, the color of moss. And she was laughing at something the boy had said, and the laugh changed her face entirely, and Julian, standing at the terrace door above, recognized the voice from the gallery, and understood that the plain girl from the march, the one he had passed without a glance 4 years, and a whole ruined understanding of the world ago, had been here all along doing the one thing he had finally learned to value. She looked up. Their eyes met across the cold, bright distance of the lawn, and Eleanor, who did not recognize him at all, felt her heart perform a strange, unaccountable stumble, and could not have said why, and looked away first, because a governess did not hold the gaze of a gentleman at a terrace door, and called the girl back from the edge of the fountain. Julian came down to the lawn. He had no good reason to, and he did not invent one, and the children, who had taken to him, already because he carried sugared almonds in his coat and told them about horses, ran to him. He let them. He looked over their heads at Eleanor and said, his voice low, that he believed they had met before, in Hartwell, the morning the regiment marched. Eleanor said that a great many people had stood at the churchyard wall that morning. He said that he remembered the bread. She said nothing, for a moment. Then she said that she was glad it had been of use, and there was something in the flatness of the words, some old closed door in them, that told him exactly how he had spoken of her that day, and that she had heard it, and that she had carried it the way he carried the whistle. He did not apologize. An apology would have been an insult, a tidy thing offered to settle an untidy debt. He said only after a silence that she should not let the girl stand so near the fountain edge in this cold, and Eleanor heard a command and bristled at it, and called the child back a second time, and did not understand that the command was the only language he had for the fear that had moved through him when he saw the small figure near the water. The children heard a man who cared whether they fell. Eleanor heard a duke's son giving orders to a governess. The truth stood exactly between them, and neither could yet see it whole. The autumn deepened. Julian found reasons to be at Wexford Park, and they were thin reasons, and the dowager noted them with the attention of a woman who had spent 50 years reading the small movements of men toward women they should not want. She did not like what she read. She had a plan for the new Captain Ashcombe, who was, after all, an heir, now however modest his fortune, and the plan had a name, and the name was Miss Cassandra Frayne. Miss Frayne was the daughter of a baronet with money and no title, and the dowager had money and a title and no fortune, and the arithmetic of the match was so clean it scarcely needed speaking. Cassandra was beautiful in the way the season prized, polished and bright and certain. And she had been told since girlhood that she was the correct choice for any room she entered, and she believed it without cruelty, because no one had ever shown her cause to doubt it. She arrived at Wexford Park in a carriage with the baronet's arms on the door, and she wore ice-blue silk and a string of pearls, and she was kind to the children in the brief performed way of a woman who did not intend to spend much time with them, and she looked at Eleanor exactly once. The way one looks at a piece of furniture to confirm it is where one expects. The dowager arranged a dinner. She arranged the seating with care. Cassandra at Julian's right hand, the governess not at the table at all, but available as governesses were, to bring the children down for 10 minutes of display and then remove them. And it was during those 10 minutes, with the boy clean and combed and silent at her side and the girl in her best sash, that the dowager turned to her guests and said, in a voice pitched to Carrie, that one did what one could for the lower orders, and that the charity girl had proved almost useful. Though of course one could not expect such a creature to understand the finer obligations of a house like this one. The table laughed. Lightly, the way a table laughs at the wit of its hostess. Cassandra smiled. And Eleanor, standing with a child's hand in each of hers, felt the old cold settle over her again and kept her face perfectly still, and felt the boy's fingers tighten around her own because the boy, who said little, understood everything. She curtsied. She took the children up. And on the stairs, out of sight of the table, the boy stopped and looked up at her and said, in his quiet way, that his great-grandmother was wrong, and that Eleanor was not a charity girl. She was the only person in the house who told the truth. Eleanor knelt on the cold stair and held him, and did not let him see that her eyes had filled, and downstairs, unknown to her, Julian had set down his fork at the dowager's words, and had not picked it up again. And the Earl had seen it, and the dowager, for all her reading, had not. It was the body that betrayed her first, as the niche of her own heart had always promised it would. A week after the dinner, Julian came upon her in the library at dusk, where she had gone to find a book of maps for the boy, who had developed a sudden hunger to know where his father had been. She had not heard him enter. She was on the library steps reaching for a high shelf, and he crossed the room without thinking, and steadied the steps with one hand, and she looked down and found his face very close to hers, and her heart, which had stumbled on the lawn, now performed something far more reckless. She came down the steps too quickly. He did not step back. For a moment they stood in the dim gold of the single candle she had lit, closer than propriety allowed, and she was aware of exactly where he was in the unlit room in the way one is aware of a fire in a cold house, and she said, to break it, that she had only come for the maps. He said the maps were on the lower shelf. Neither of them moved toward the lower shelf. He asked her then, quietly, why she tended the children of a house that did not value her. She might have deflected. She had deflected such questions all her life. Then the dimness and the nearness and the 4 years of carried words undid something in her, and she told him the truth, that the children had been frightened, and that she knew what it was to be frightened and have no one trouble to notice. and that she had decided long ago not to become the kind of person who walked past a frightened child, because there was no reward in stopping. She said it plainly, without self-pity, as a simple account of how she had chosen to live. And Julian, who had walked past the plain bread and the plain faces for 4 years and had buried a brave boy on a road he had judged safe, felt the last of his old understanding of the world fall away entirely, and knew, with the clean terror of a man who has finally seen the thing he wants, and that the knowing changed everything and settled nothing. He stepped back. He said she should not stay so late in the cold library. It was a command, and it was the old language. And this time, for the first time, Eleanor heard underneath it the thing it was protecting, and she looked at him in the candlelight with a new and frightening understanding. And neither of them said anything more, and she gathered the maps and went up, and her hands were not steady on the stairs. The dowager moved quickly after that, because the dowager, whatever else she was not a fool. She had seen the captain's stillness at the dinner and the captain's thin reasons for riding over. And she summoned Eleanor to the black silk morning room on a gray afternoon and told her with the unhurried cruelty of weather that her services would no longer be required after the quarter, that a more suitable governess had been engaged, and that she would do well to remember her station and not to mistake a gentleman's idle country kindness for anything that a girl of her sort had any business hoping for. She said the word again. Then, the charity girl said it for the third time, and in the third manner, no longer a public performance but a private blade, and she watched Eleanor's face to see it land. It landed. Eleanor felt the floor of her small, carefully built life give way beneath her. The children she loved to be taken from her. The one place she had been useful to be closed against her. And worse, far worse, the naming aloud of the hope she had not even let herself fully form. Dragged into the cold light, and shown to be the foolish thing the dowager said it was. She did not weep. She said that she understood, and that she asked only to be allowed to say goodbye to the children properly. The dowager said that would not be necessary. And Eleanor went up to pack her trunk, and on the way she passed the long gallery where, 4 years ago, a man she did not yet know had heard her reading through a half-open door, and she did not know that, and the gallery was empty, and the loneliness of it was the loneliest thing in the world, lonelier even than the grave with the worn-away name. Mrs. Pell found her packing. The old housekeeper stood in the doorway of the small, cold room and said nothing for a long moment, and then she crossed and took the folded moss-colored shawl from the trunk and put it back into Eleanor's hands and closed her fingers around it and said that it had been hers to keep and would stay hers. And then Mrs. B.D. Pell, who had served the family 40 years and held its secrets the way old houses hold cold, told Eleanor a thing she had not meant to tell, that the captain had asked after her by name the very first night, that the dowager had lied and said it hardly signified, and that a man did not ask a name and then carry it 4 years unless the name had weight. Eleanor said it changed nothing. Mrs. Pell said it changed everything, and that Eleanor was a fool if she packed her trunk and crept away, and let the dowager write the ending, and that she had not taken the girl for a coward. Eleanor looked at the old woman for a long moment. Then she set down the shawl, and she did not finish packing. The dowager's masterstroke was to be a ball. The Earl had come home and a ball at Wexford Park to mark his return, and the dowager intended to announce his friend Captain Ashcombe's engagement to Miss Frayne was the obvious and crushing instrument. She would settle the whole matter in the one arena where her authority was absolute, the bright, loud, crowded room where the verdicts of her world were rendered, and where a governess had no standing at all. She had the invitation sent. She had the orchestra engaged. She had Cassandra, dressed in silver. And she had, as a final economy of cruelty, instructed that the children be brought down at the height of the evening to make their bow to the company, and that the governess might bring them and then withdraw, so that Eleanor would be made to stand in the bright room in her gray wool, and watch the engagement of the man whose name she had been forbidden to hope for, before she was sent away for good. The night of the ball, the great house at Wexford Park blazed with every candle it owned. The orchestra played in the long ballroom, under the portraits of the family's better days, and the floor filled with silk and superfine and the cold fire of jewels. And at the head of the room, the dowager sat in state, with her fan and her certainty, with Cassandra arranged at her hand like a bright argument. The captain stood near them in his dark coat, and his face was still as ice over a river. And only the Earl, who knew him, saw that the stillness was the stillness of a man who has come to a decision and is waiting only for the moment to act on it. Eleanor brought the children down at the appointed hour. She wore her gray wool turned at the cuffs, with a moss-colored shawl Mrs. Pell had pressed back into her hands, and she walked into the blazing room with a child's hand in each of hers and her chin level, and her gray eyes fixed on the middle distance, exactly as she had stood at the churchyard wall 4 years before. The room's attention moved over her and dismissed her in the same motion. She was the help. She brought the children to make their bow before the dowager, and the boy bowed, and the girl curtsied, and the dowager inclined her head a precise half-inch, and then turned to the company, and lifted her voice, and prepared to render her verdict and announce her match. She got as far as her grandson's name, because Julian Ashcombe crossed the ballroom. He did not hurry. He crossed the bright, loud floor in the silence that seemed to spread out ahead of him as the room understood, by degrees, that something was happening that was not on the program, and he came to a stop before the governess in the gray wool gown, before the whole assembled verdict of the dowager's world, and he looked at Eleanor Vane, and he did the thing no one in that room had thought possible. He bowed to her, low and full, the bow a man makes to a woman of consequence, and into the silence that the bow had made, he said the thing he had carried across 4 years, and a war and the death of a brave boy on a safe road. He said, his voice level and clear, and meant to carry to the dowager at the head of the room, that he would marry no one but the woman who tended what no one else would. The orchestra had stopped. No one had told it to. The dowager's fan was still in her hand, halfway to its measured height, and it did not complete the motion. Cassandra's bright, certain face went through a series of small changes and arrived at last at something almost like relief, because she had been the correct choice in every room of her life, and had never once been chosen, and she understood in that ballroom the difference. The crowd's attention, which had moved over Eleanor and dismissed her, came back, and truly saw her, the level chin, and the gray eyes, and the turned cuffs in the child's hand, still in each of hers, and the room rearranged itself silently around the new fact of her worth. Eleanor did not move. The words reached her across the bright floor, and she could not at first make them mean what they meant. She had spent 4 years being told what she was, and the world's verdict had been so consistent that this single contrary sentence, spoken by the one voice with the power to overturn it, struck her almost as a kind of vertigo. The boy's hand tightened in hers. The girl looked up. And Julian, watching her face, saw that she did not yet believe it, and so he closed the last of the distance, and he took her gloved hand, the one the boy was not holding, and he said her name. Just her name. Eleanor. The first time he had ever spoken it, and he spoke it the way a man speaks the one true word he has been. Saving the dowager rose. She was old, and she was proud, and she had buried more than most, and she was not a woman to fall in a public room. Yet the thing she had built her life to defend had just been overturned in her own ballroom by her own grandson's heir before the whole of the county, and the certainty went out of her face like warmth out of a room when a door is opened. And she said, in a voice that fragmented on the second word, that he forgot himself, that he forgot what was owed. And Julian turned to her, and he did not match her cruelty, and he did not crow. He said only with a quietness that was its own kind of mercy, that he had forgotten nothing, that he had remembered at last, and that he hoped she might in time be glad of it. It was not a blow. It was a door left open for a proud woman to walk through with what dignity she could keep. And the dowager, who was not a fool, understood the mercy in it even as it displaced her, and she sat back down, and she was quiet. The earl came forward, then the master of the house, and he took Eleanor's other hand from the boy with a smile. And he said, loud enough for the room and for his grandmother, that the governess who had given his son back his voice would always have a place at Wexford Park, and that he could imagine no better mistress for his friend's house. And with those words the procedural seal was set, the master of the great house confirming before the assembled county what the captain's bow had begun, so that no dowager and no Miss Frayne and no whisper of the season could undo it. Cassandra Frayne curtsied to Eleanor correctly, and even kindly, and went to find her father, and was, in the end, not unhappy to be released from a correctness that had never once asked her what she wanted. The following spring came late, and then came all at once the way it does in that part of the country, and Wexford Park, which had been a cold house for so long, learned slowly to be warm. They were married in the small church at Hartwell, not the great one, with the children standing up beside them, and Mrs. Pell weeping frankly in the second pew, and the curate's old churchyard visible through the open door. After the service, Eleanor walked out alone for a moment in her wedding clothes, to the small worn stone with the name worn away to a single letter, and she knelt and set a sprig of rosemary against it, as she had every week for years, and she did not hear Julian come up behind her until he knelt down beside her in his fine coat on the cold ground. He had brought the boy's tin whistle in his pocket, the flat shape he had touched without knowing for 4 years. And he set it down for a moment in the grass beside the rosemary, the brave child of the road and the lonely child of the stone, keeping each other company in the spring light. The road he had judged safe, and the boy who had not come back in a low voice meant for her alone. She did not tell him it was not his fault. She knew better than that, knew that some weights are not lifted, but only shared. She put her hand over his where it rested in the grass, and she said that they would tend it together now, the brave child and the lonely one, and every frightened thing the great cold house had taught them both to notice. And Julian, who had marched to war, able to read a person's worth in the cut of a gown, bowed his head beside the worn stone, and let himself be at last entirely seen. That evening, the fire was lit in the long gallery where 4 years before a man had stood with his hat in his hand and heard a voice reading through a half-open door. And the children fell asleep on the hearthrug in the warm light, and Eleanor sat with her husband in the house that was now her home and her charge and her own. And on the small table beside her lay the worn miniature she had carried in her trunk all those years, the only likeness of the mother she barely remembered, set out now at last in a house warm enough to keep it. Outside the tall windows the late snow of that strange spring had begun to fall, soft and unhurried, settling on the gray stone, and the bare avenue, and the whole quiet sweep of Wexford Park, on the home that had searched 4 years for the woman it had passed without a glance, and on the rosemary by the small worn stone, where it would lie white and unmelting until the morning. Thank you for staying to the end of Eleanor's story. If the moment he crossed that floor stayed with you, leave a word below and tell me where it found you.